Hello, Dr. David. This is my disease project presentation on smallpox. I've decided to do a video because my camera and microphone are not working on my laptop. So first slide is my title page. Next slide. What is smallpox? Smallpox is caused by the variola virus, which has an unknown origin. It is thought to date back to the Egyptian Empire around 3rd century BCE, in which recently doctors have found a small-like rash on 3 of those mummies from that era. And the earliest written account of smallpox is in 4th century China CE. Spread of smallpox can be attributed to growth of civilizations, exploration, and trading routes between civilizations, basically any human-to-human contact. Smallpox was eradicated globally by 1980, but samples of the virus have been saved for research purposes and are located at undisclosed locations. And there's no cure or treatment available, which I'll get into later, but a vaccine does exist, although routine vaccination is not necessary due to the low chance of being exposed to smallpox since it was eradicated in 1980 and the high possibility of side effects. Next slide. Structure and life cycle of smallpox. Smallpox is similar to other viruses in that the virion penetrates cell membrane of the host cell. Smallpox genome is made of DNA, so replication and transcription both take place in the cytoplasm, as opposed to viruses that have an RNA genome, which replication and transcription takes place in the nucleus. Once the virion is inside the cell, the outer coating is shed. A phage protein DNA copies are produced, which recombine into a functional virion. The new virions bud off the host cell, and the host cell is destroyed, and those new virions seek new host cells to continue repeating the replication cycle. Next slide. Transmission. How is smallpox transmitted? Primarily through direct or prolonged human-to-human contact. It can also be transmitted through droplets from coughing or sneezing. Contagiousness begins once sores appear in the mouth and throat, which is part of the early rash stage, which I'll get into later. You can also contract smallpox by coming into contact with contaminated objects, such as if an infected person sneezes or coughs into their hand or directly onto a surface, and then the uninfected individual comes in contact with that surface, they could contract smallpox. Going along the lines of contagiousness, smallpox is contagious until the last smallpox scab falls off, and there's no evidence of this virus being spread by animals or insects. Therefore, humans are the only known vector of smallpox. Next slide. Mechanism of action for smallpox. It is not well understood by doctors and scientists, but they have studied mousepox, which is a primary subject for orthopox virus pathogenesis, and smallpox is an orthopox virus. It is believed that the virus spreads locally near the site in which the virus was contracted and eventually spreads to the lymphatic system and then it enters the bloodstream. Finally, the virus spreads to the skin or superficial areas where the lesions occur and are visible to the human eye. Next slide. Signs and symptoms of smallpox during each stage. The first stage is incubation, which lasts about 7 to 19 days. There usually aren't any signs or symptoms, and it is not contagious at that point. The next stage is initial symptom stage, which lasts 2 to 4 days. It consists of fever, body and muscle aches, sometimes vomiting and nausea, and you can be contagious during this stage. Next slide. Next is the early rash stage, which lasts about 4 days. The rash looks like small red spots are located in the tongue and mouth. The spots can break open and turn into sores, which possibly spreads the virus due to it being a superficial area. The rash appears on skin from head to toe once it evolves from the tongue and mouth. The sores on the body from head to toe will fill with a thick, opaque fluid, and during this stage, the individual is contagious. Following the early rash stage is a pustular rash and scab stage, which lasts about 10 days. The sores become pustules, which are pimple-like, or also blister-like, that are filled with pus. The pustules eventually start to crust over and scab over, but the individual is still contagious during this stage. Next slide. Following the pustular rash and scab stage is the scabs fall off stage, which lasts about 6 days, but the individual is still contagious until the no scab stage, in which all the scabs have fallen off. The patient is no longer contagious. Next slide. Diagnosis for smallpox. Diagnosis for smallpox is kind of hard to do due to its rarity. It may be hard to diagnose during the initial stages by doctors just because it is not a common diagnosis made nowadays since it was eradicated some years ago. But the diagnosis would be made based on the appearance of the skin and location of lesions on the individual's body. Definitive testing can be done by the CDC using tissue samples. Next slide. Treatment for smallpox. Although there is no treatment or cure for smallpox, there is a vaccine, and the effectiveness is highly dependent on exposure. Obviously, with most vaccines, before exposure is when the vaccine will be most effective, but also can be effective if the vaccine is used within days of the exposure, and it can protect the individual. Such as if the individual still contracts smallpox, they might get less sick than somebody who was unvaccinated to begin with and remains unvaccinated. Once the last stage has occurred, the vaccine will not be effective at all. Antiviral drugs have been approved by the FDA and shown to stop growth of the virus that causes smallpox and similar virus in animal trials, but they have not been tested on humans. Examples of those drugs include tecovirimat, cidofovir, and brincidofovir. Next slide. Prevention for smallpox. Because it's an eradicated virus, there's really no need for routine vaccination, as I stated earlier. But if an outbreak were to occur, health officials would use the vaccine already created to help control it. And infected individuals would be isolated and quarantined in order to stop an outbreak and it spreading to other individuals because of its primary transmission of human-to-human contact. And next slide is my bibliography. Thank you for listening to my presentation on smallpox.